France, a nation destined by excellence and empire to create some of the greatest feats of engineering the world has ever seen. For a millennium, France was ruled by monarchs who compared themselves to gods and who waged wars of aggression across Europe to maintain their supremacy over the continent. Their quest for perfection drove this nation to build on a previously unimaginable scale.
Notre Dame is a structure of breathtaking innovation.
But their wanton extravagance led to revolution, bringing the empire to political and economic ruin. However, from the chaos emerged an extraordinary conqueror.
Napoleon was a force of nature.
His single-minded goal was a French empire on the scale of Rome. (1163), Paris. An army of construction workers pulling endless loads of limestone swarmed over the Ile de la Cité, an island in the middle of the Seine. This site has been sacred for thousands of years. Originally, it was a Druid shrine. That was transformed into a Roman temple dedicated to Jupiter. Later, it became a pilgrimage destination for Christians. They journeyed to honor Saint Denis, who was tortured and beheaded here. In 1163, the King of France ordered a grand new cathedral to be constructed on the site. It was intended to be the envy of all Europe. The king was Louis VII. The cathedral is Notre Dame, to this day among the most magnificent cathedrals ever built.
Allons enfants de le petit, le jour de gloire est arrivé. The day of glory has arrived. Hello, I'm Peter Weller. I learned the Marseillaise, perhaps the world's most passionate national anthem, about 15 years ago when I decided to take some time off and come here to the streets of Paris and retrace the steps of the French Revolution. But the immediate legacy of the French Revolution was by no means days of glory. It was a reign of reactionary terror that left France in political chaos with headless corpses and eventually brought on Napoleon. Democracy was to come later. But just as the foundations of democracy are bathed in blood, so are they also bathed in beauty. And the glory and beauty of France endure in its invention, innovation, in the arts and sciences, in its civil planning and architecture, and in its incomparable facility to build, like a cathedral. The word cathedral does not just infer some big old church, generically. It's taken from the word cathedra, meaning seat. It is the seat of the bishop or the archbishop, the pope's representative in a particular parish or district. This is the Cathedral of Paris, Notre Dame de Paris, Our Lady of Paris, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It ain't bad, is it? Matter of fact, it's probably the world's most famous church. Now, before this, in the early Middle Ages, churches were built in a style called Romanesque, using elements of real ancient Rome, like columns and capitals. Romanesque churches were short and fat and squatty, with big, thick walls, little bitty windows, barreled vaults, rounded arches. Even the Romanesque sculpture was austere and solid. But the churches didn't hold a lot of folks. And the Bishop of Paris, Maurice de Sully, not only wanted a church that would fill up with thousands, he wanted a church that would inspire awe.
Maurice de Sully was regarded as a hero by the people. After years of internal strife, he and Louis VII wanted to bring peace and consolidate their control over the feudal lands of France. The great cathedral would be the cornerstone of a new regime and a symbol of their absolute authority. It would be built in a way never before seen on Earth.
Maurice was the Bishop of Paris at a moment when Paris really was a boom town. Louis VII established Paris definitively as the capital of the Kingdom of France. I think Maurice wanted to build a building that was worthy of the status of the city and men of enormous wealth and power.
2 centuries, from the 1100s to the 1300s, that it took to build Notre Dame, from soup to nuts, is a period we call Gothic. But originally, Gothic was a disparaging term. Isn't that always the way when the next generations don't like anything that came before? Gothic falsely meant of the gods, or barbaric. But Gothic is majestic, with tall decorative spires and thin lancet windows and round rose windows and stained glass and huge massive piers inside, wide naves. When you think Gothic, think vertical.
The Gothic, one of its primary characteristics is the sense of both spaciousness and scale and extreme lightness, both structural lightness and then an interior filled with light filtering in through the stained glass windows. It presented a kind of new vision or new image of heaven to the worshiper.
Notre Dame would grow to be the size of a football pitch. Its walls would soar 100 feet into the air. It was big enough to dwarf and engulf Maurice de Sully's old church, which continued to hold services during the early years of Notre Dame's construction. Scaffolding provided a framework for lifting heavy equipment and materials, wooden braces and stone, for the creation of the elaborately vaulted roof. An ingenious man-powered wheel crane mounted at the top of the scaffolding lifted the heaviest materials.
A man or two would have gotten in the wheel and essentially like a hamster hoisted the materials up.
Thousands of workers spent their entire working lives erecting these walls.
Each mason seems to have had a mark which he would carve into the blocks so that they would get paid by the piece. One often has the romantic notion that each stone was a kind of carved prayer, but it was much more practical than that. If there was no money, there was no work.
So many thousands of tons of stone were needed that it started a craze called the cult of carts, wherein men, noblemen and commoners, would hook themselves to ox carts and pull the stones seeking absolution along the way. Now, as opposed to Rome in the Renaissance and even now, where architecture is deductive, that means it's thought out on paper according to mathematical proportions, Gothic architecture was additive. Some of these churches were just drawn in the dirt and then they went up. It's not to say that they didn't have a plan, but if they made a mistake, they added a pier or a wall or a pointed arch. Now, the thing with Notre Dame is that the weight of these stones, the downforce was so incredible. They also had the added problem of the wind because they were building up. Subsequently, they invoked this fantastic engineering element called the flying buttress. The flying buttress is this sort of half arch which displaces the weight out and then down. Notre Dame was so magnificent that it started a craze of Gothic building throughout Northern Europe, even before it was half finished.
Previously, builders with soaring ambitions had always been thwarted by gravity. The crushing weight of a stone roof created too much outward stress on the walls, so the whole edifice collapsed. Buttressing may have even started out as an ingenious type of scaffolding to support the external walls while being erected. But at this pivotal moment, as architects scrawled out brilliant blueprints in the shadows of the rising cathedral, the solution of the flying buttress became a design element for all subsequent ages. With such massive support, load-bearing walls could sustain large apertures for the creation of beautiful windows. Previously, this was impossible because the walls were too weak. By 1190, the walls of the north and south nave and the lower vaults were in place. The western towers were also underway, rising independently to the height of the Great Rose Window, which is perhaps the most famous stained glass window in the world. By 1196, Maurice de Sully's health was failing, making him more than ever determined to ensure that Notre Dame would be the most extraordinary cathedral in Europe, even if he wouldn't live to see it.
Maurice de Sully, in his will, left money for the roof of the cathedral, and through his generosity left his mark on his beloved church.
The Cathedral of Notre Dame was finally completed in the mid-14th century, nearly 200 years after building work started. It was the symbol of an ascendant nation. Its grandeur and beauty was a harbinger of the power and glory of France in the centuries to follow. But first, the empire would be rocked to its foundations by a monarch who compared himself to the sun god, who encircled France with spectacular fortifications, and who made himself the largest palace in the Western world. (1648). France had a new ruling family, the House of Bourbon. The country had recently emerged from a century of warfare and devastating epidemics of plague. The new king was only 9 years old. His name was Louis XIV. Louis started his reign at a time when the aristocracy, which had lost much of its ancestral wealth and privilege, was feeling particularly vengeful. With a mere child on the throne, the nobles saw an opportunity to restore their rightful position. They rose in revolt, forcing Louis to flee and go into hiding. But the royal family regained control. And Louis vowed he would never allow his authority to be challenged again. As the boy grew into manhood, his famous taste for the extravagant grew too, especially for monumental construction projects. Unlike Notre Dame, built for the greater glory of God, Louis decided to build a monument dedicated to himself. In a radical break with the past, Louis took absolute control of France by moving the seat of government out of Paris and establishing a new one in a small town 13 miles south of the capital. It was called Versailles. In 1661, Louis's architects began work on a colossal building complex there. It would become the nerve center of a nascent French empire.
Louis XIV wanted spectacular achievements. He wanted spectacular engineering, spectacular architecture. Versailles itself is a statement that says a lot about the kind of image he wanted to project to the world. You know, he wanted to be #1 power.
Versailles. It was here that the powdered wig and puff pastry were raised to high art. 700 rooms, 2,000 windows, 1,250 fireplaces, 1,800 acres of gardens, 1,400 working fountains. And not only did Louis call these magnificent digs home, he also called them office. Because if you're the king, you don't go to work. Work comes to you. After all, this is the dude who said, "L'État c'est moi." The state is me. And what better place to be the state than in a pad that's got an entire hallway made out of mirrors? Let me put it this way. If you were called on the carpet at Versailles, it was a pretty long carpet. By 1682, when Versailles was finished, it would have become the symbol of the power and the glory of the regime ancien.
Louis's gardens and fountains were the most beautiful that post-Roman Europe had yet produced, but they required massive amounts of water. To provide it, Louis commissioned probably his most extraordinary feat of engineering, the Marly machine, an enormous pumping station which transported water from the Seine 3 miles upstream to supply the fountains at Versailles. Inaugurated by Louis himself in 1684, the Marly machine was a miracle of hydraulic engineering. It was powered by the current of the River Seine flowing through 14 gigantic water wheels, and it was capable of supplying 100 million gallons of water a day. In his own mind, Louis now transcended mere mortality. He identified himself with Apollo, the Greek god of the sun, and adopted the name Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King. When Louis XIV had established his absolute power at home, he put his mind to foreign policy.
Louis XIV was an aggressor in a Europe that France was already the leading power.
To achieve his dreams of empire, the French monarch consulted one of the greatest military engineers of all time, Sébastien de Vauban. Vauban demonstrated his brilliance on the battlefield in his revolutionary strategy of attack called the parallel trench method. It would save many lives and change the way wars were fought for hundreds of years. 1673, Vauban put his parallel method of attack to the ultimate test, under fire at the siege of the formidable Dutch fortress at Maastricht. He positioned the French troops along a first trench running parallel to the fortress 600 yards away and out of the range of the Dutch cannon fire. The parallel trenches moved forward until the artillery was close enough to make breaches in the walls of the fort. The technique worked perfectly. French troops swarmed through the breaches, overwhelming the Dutch defenders. Vauban's new trench warfare system led to victory after victory and allowed Louis to approach close enough to inspect the front lines, a hazardous duty for previous rulers.
Vauban offered him the possibility to be the winner at the war. The most beautiful attack of Vauban was the one where the king is here.
Each spring, and magnificently attired, Louis would lead his army to besiege border towns. He took much of the court with him, including his queen and his mistress. Vauban's siege tactics allowed Louis to extend the borders of France. His defensive genius, building and renovating 300 forts within the borders, virtually sealed the nation from attack.
In ancient Rome, the geometrical shape that was considered most divine for building was the circle or the square for its precision and symmetry. We call this today the centralized plan. Now, this centralized plan became the inspiration for Vauban to build a fort, except in the shape of a star. But the real genius of Vauban was that he could adapt these forts to any terrain. He could read the valleys and the rivers and the cliffs and build his trenches and moats and walls to maximum effectiveness. He could eliminate blind spots where offenders could hide, at the same time giving the defenders the best vantage points in which to return fire.
What Vauban gave to the Kingdom of France is the fact that during 150 years after him, never the war became inside the territory of France. The war was always outside. That's very good for the king.
But Louis's unchecked spending on those hundreds of forts left France on the verge of bankruptcy. Vauban offered the king a simple solution: tax the nobility and clergy as well as the peasantry. His novel idea was rejected, but the notion would be considered again 100 years later during the Revolution. But for the moment, the Sun King enjoyed being the most powerful monarch on earth. His expansion into Europe well underway, he would attempt to dominate the oceans by constructing a waterway from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, a passage no one else but Louis believed was possible.
He tamed nature just like he did empires. He pulled these parks and gardens of Versailles right out of a marsh. He spared no expense in diverting the rivers around Versailles to fill up these 1,400 fountains. But while these fountains were being designed, there was a salt tax collector named Pierre-Paul Riquet who had water dreams of his own. He dreamed of connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the North Atlantic Ocean with a waterway that would cut all the way through France. The influence of France during the reign of Louis XIV was so profound that French became the spoken language amongst the educated of Europe, as well as the language of diplomacy amongst all the European monarchies. But Louis XIV detested dependency upon these monarchies, particularly Spain for its access from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Well, this tax collector with a dream, Pierre-Paul Riquet, was going to fix that little problem for Louis with the Canal du Midi that would not only connect the Mediterranean Sea to the North Atlantic, but would pave the way for the 19th century industrial revolution, when to have a canal would be an absolute must for any country that wanted to make money.
Pierre-Paul Riquet was only a boy when he first heard about the idea of a waterway running through France. It would allow ships to avoid the long sea voyage around Spain. He dreamed about it all his life.
I doubt whether Riquet was very easy to live with, because he was so caught up with this project. He was so, I think it's fair to say, he was obsessed by it. Something in him made him want to build, made him want to achieve something concrete that would go down for posterity.
1662. At 52, after amassing a private fortune in the lucrative office of royal tax collector, Riquet was ready to step out of comfortable retirement and into engineering history. He devoted his time and considerable powers of invention to finding a solution to one of the most vexing architectural problems of the century: how to keep the canal full of water. Riquet discovered a number of rivers that could be channeled to feed the canal at its highest point. But he would need to control the flow of water all year round.
It was going to be dry during the summer. So Riquet understood you needed to get a big volume of water as a reservoir. And the site was found, which was the Saint-Ferréol Dam. And that was absolutely spectacular. That was the key to the whole project.
A reservoir. It was a stroke of genius. Riquet had overcome the dilemma that no one before him had succeeded in doing. There was just one small problem. To supply the canal with sufficient water, he would have to build the largest dam the world had ever seen. It would stand 105 feet high and be 450 feet wide. Behind it, the artificial lake, which would collect water from several watercourses, would hold 2 billion gallons. This was the Bassin de Saint-Ferréol. It may have looked good on paper, but there was only one man in the world with enough money to foot the bill for such a radical project. To convince Louis, Riquet had to find a way to persuade his all-powerful finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. So he sketched out his ideas into blueprints and presented them at court. Colbert recognized at once the scheme's potential to provide revenue and swell the nation's coffers. The next step was to convince Louis, who liked the idea enormously. The canal would be a grand project worthy of the reign of the Sun King.
Louis XIV acutely realized the potential of architecture to establish an image that would embody not only his personal authority and status, but also that of the Kingdom of France that he ruled.
Nevertheless, Riquet had to volunteer his own savings to fund 1/3 of the projected cost before Louis would give his approval. In 1666, although he had no background in engineering himself, Riquet threw himself into the task of building his massive canal. He began with the construction of the Saint-Ferréol Reservoir. It took 4 years to build. While work on the reservoir and feeder system was underway, the first stones of the canal itself were laid in Toulouse on the 17th of November, 1667. By January 1668, 2,000 laborers were on site. At the peak of the building, Riquet had a workforce of 12,000, including 600 women because of a shortage of men. To ensure the reliability of his workforce, he paid well above the going rate. provided affordable housing, and even gave holidays and pay for days off sick.
He introduced an early form of social security. You know, there was such a thing as paid leave, which was absolutely unheard of at that time. So he was well ahead of his times, but he had to be able to implement the project in a decent time.
It wasn't long before the size of Riquet's engineering project and his generous terms for the workers began to attract criticism. Opponents of the canal accused Riquet of wasting public money for his own glory on a project that was doomed to fail. Even Colbert began to have doubts. In 1677, 10 years into construction, the project reached a crisis as the canal approached the southern slope of the Anserune Ridge. Riquet proposed a daring idea. He would carve out the world's first navigable tunnel through the mountain, and he would do it with explosives. When word reached Paris that he planned to tunnel through a mountain ridge, the Minister of Finance, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, ordered all work stopped pending an investigation into what he thought was an impossible scheme: to use explosives to make the cavities for the tunnel. It had never been done before and was incredibly dangerous. Riquet's life work and personal fortune were at stake.
Colbert said, "We just don't believe you're going to succeed in this." And so Riquet, the story is that he increased the numbers of men and women working on the job, and that by the time the inspector came, I think it was 2 weeks later, they'd been able to get cut through and provide proof that the tunnel was feasible.
For 15 years, Riquet had confronted every conceivable obstacle, natural and man-made, to build his beloved canal. But at 76 years of age, he was exhausted.
On October the 1st of 1680, Riquet, gravely ill, called his son to his bedside and asked, "Où est le canal?" Where is the canal? His son responded that it was only about 3 miles away from the sea. Riquet passed away. The canal was opened 8 months later, 8 months too late for his creator to see it.
On the 15th of May, 1681, the lock gates of the Canal du Midi opened for business for the first time.
Canal du Midi is a masterpiece. The solution for transport by water in France is the best solution still today, and the Canal du Midi shows the way.
The Canal du Midi was but one of dozens of projects Louis XIV built in his pursuit of his own magnificence. But by the end of his reign, profligate spending had brought France to the brink of ruin. The absolute autocracy of his rule and the huge debts he ran up would sow the seeds of revolt a century later.
In 1789, the monarchy was deposed by the French Revolution. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had their heads cut off in the Place du Roi. But the reign of terror would turn in on itself, and Danton and Robespierre and the other fathers of the French Revolution would either be murdered in their bathtub or die by the guillotine themselves. And out of this chaos would come a young, brilliant general from Corsica who would lead France into a new era of empire.
1795. This young officer from a small Mediterranean island was poised to make his first attempt to seize power in France. Paris was reeling from 3 years of bloodthirsty turmoil in the wake of the French Revolution. His rule would capture the imagination of the French people and launch him onto the world stage as one of the greatest conquerors in history. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon was a force of nature. Audacity was his middle name. Napoleon imposed himself upon Europe with such force that he goes down in the annals with Caesar and few others.
Napoleon's rise to power was meteoric, from the head of the Army of the Interior to Commander-in-Chief of the French forces in Italy in just 1 year.
In 1796, Austria attacked French troops in Italy, and Napoleon took a disaffected and undernourished army and turned it into a veritable force. He beat Austria in battle after battle, eating up most of northern Italy, finally even bringing that serene Republic of Venice to its knees. When Napoleon returned to Paris, he was a star, and then he started to take over. But believe me, after 10 years of the blood and guts of the French Revolution, the people of Paris and France were ready to say, "Praise the Lord." In 1804, Napoleon was crowned Emperor at Notre Dame. It is said there's a preparatory drawing of Jacques Louis David of the event where Napoleon's taking the crown from the Pope and crowning himself. He also turned to his brother and said, "If Daddy could only see us now." Now, with his astounding ego, it's interesting that Napoleon was averse to creating monuments to himself, but he created one, 70,000 tons of stone in the shape of an arch, modeled on the Arch of Titus in the Forum of Rome. It would be called the Arc de Triomphe.
In 1809, Napoleon chose François Chalgrin's design for his triumphal arch. For the site, Napoleon selected the end of the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in the Place de l'Étoile. The structure would consist of a simple arch topped by a vaulted passageway, 98 feet high and 49 feet wide. In total, the arch would be 164 feet high and 148 feet wide, twice as big as the one in Rome that inspired it. At the base of the pillars are 4 huge relief sculptures commemorating the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The view of that grand arch, majestically crowning the most celebrated boulevard in Paris, expresses the essence of Napoleonic style and grandeur.
Napoleon was a self-made man, and that's in many ways what much of the revolution stood for, was that kind of brash individualism which took people's breath away.
By 1812, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe, but then the boy bit off more than he could chew. He invaded Russia, and the rest, as we say, is history. Poor supply trains, harsh winters, the resiliency of the Russian people, Napoleon was defeated, forced to abdicate, and exiled to the island of Elba. But he escaped and enjoyed a short reprise to power we call the 100 Days, before he was defeated at Waterloo and exiled again, this time to St. Helena, and for good. Perhaps in respect and awe that the French felt for Napoleon, they continued to work on the Arc de Triomphe until it was finished in 1836. And the Arc de Triomphe would stand as the emblem of France until a wiry, bizarre skeleton of a building made out of iron would change the idea of an urban skyline forever.
The Arc de Triomphe towered over Paris for another 50 years before yielding supremacy to an iron spire, which would capture the imagination of the whole world. In 1889, Paris created one of the most memorable and daring monuments on Earth, the Eiffel Tower. In the years following Napoleon's defeat, France survived 3 bloody revolutions in its turbulent progress away from the rule of kings and emperors towards democracy. The 1880s marked the zenith of the French Empire, when it was a colonial superpower governing a third of Africa, most of Indochina, and a wide swathe of the Caribbean. The International Exhibition in Paris in 1889 was intended to celebrate the centenary of the Revolution and establish a new era of glory for France. The government chose a grand centerpiece for the exposition, a breathtaking tower, 1,000 feet high. It was a stunning symbol of optimism and self-confidence.
The Minister of Commerce, Edouard Lacroix, saw it as a symbol of progress, where he said humanity gravitates endlessly upward.
A design competition attracted 100 proposals, including one from the engineering firm of Gustave Eiffel. Since the 1830s, engineers had been trying to build such a tower, but without success. Eiffel's international reputation as a superb builder of enormous bridges and megastructures, together with his elegant design for the tower, made him an easy winner. But Eiffel's tower didn't please everyone. As soon as his designs were made public, there was an enormous outcry, mostly from Parisian artists and intellectuals.
It was claimed that it was ugly, it was industrial, it was useless. It was a travesty to the Parisian landscape, which contained all sorts of wonderful classical structures.
Today we take the Eiffel Tower for granted, but if you think about it in its time, this thing was pretty bizarre. Gustave Eiffel was about to transform the concept and appearance not only of a civil structure, but an entire city's skyline. This thing was going to be the forerunner of the skyscraper, and a lot of folks in Paris didn't dig it. Just like 100 years later, they didn't particularly like the pyramid from IMP in front of the Louvre. But with the Eiffel Tower, it wasn't just the city do-gooders, but serious architects and writers voraciously lobbied against it. Guy de Maupassant supposedly said, "I'll eat there because it's the only place in Paris where I don't have to look at the thing."
The tower, at 980 feet high, was the tallest man-made structure in the world. In January 1887, Eiffel broke the ground at the Champ de Mars on the left bank of the Seine and immediately encountered his first problem. Soil samples taken at the site of the two piers alongside the riverbank proved wet and soft, a serious obstacle for a 7,000-ton tower. Eiffel's solution showed a highly innovative approach to anchoring his massive edifice. For the riverside foundations, he sank airtight iron chambers, or caissons, down into the soft ground so the workers could excavate below water level until they met solid rock. The foundations were set on the diagonal, so the tower's 4 gigantic columns would exert their thrust at right angles to the foundation blocks. Eiffel also displayed his genius in the design for the cylindrical shoes that held the columns. In each, he placed a hydraulic piston so he could align the columns precisely once they were erected. At this point, Eiffel confronted the single greatest challenge of all, the force of the wind. His solution to the problem would chart a course for all future skyscraper technology. The most illustrious exponents of 20th century architecture would all follow in his footsteps. Eiffel was a leading authority in the aerodynamics of high-standing frames, but even he was venturing into the unknown. The mercurial architect utilized a series of lattice-trussed piers, precisely calculated with incurving edges to mitigate the effects of wind. He designed the tower so that it would never sway more than 4 to 5 inches in the most severe gale the tower was likely to experience. On the 1st of July, 1887, the tower began to rise. Huge pieces of the iron structure were hoisted into place by steam-powered cranes. 2/3 of their rivets were inserted in the workshops to facilitate quick assembly on the site.
Now, one of the ways in which Eiffel did things rapidly was to prefabricate parts. He was a master at organizing his projects.
Eiffel's streamlined method was a great success. In contrast to the decades it took to construct earlier large monuments, or the nearly 2 centuries it took to build Notre Dame, Eiffel's tower was completed in only 22 months and employed just 300 site workers. When it was completed in 1889, Gustave Eiffel's masterpiece replaced the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt as the tallest man-made structure in the world. A record it retained for 41 years until 1930, when it was surpassed by New York City's Chrysler Building.
What's wonderful about the Eiffel Tower is that it so horrified the French for the first few years after it was built. It reflected French technological modernity, architectural audacity that did not lay well with some of the traditional elites. And today, it's now regarded as simply beautiful.
On June the 21st, 1889, the Eiffel Tower was open to the world. Gustave Eiffel conducted personally guided tours for many celebrities and royals, including Buffalo Bill, the Shah of Persia, the King of Siam, the Prince of Wales, even Thomas Edison. Young women bought dresses called Eiffel climbers. The tower was the hit of the exposition, attracting almost 2 million people. Gustave Eiffel had financed almost 80% of the tower in exchange for the proceeds from all the concessions. He got his money back within a year, and the tower eventually made him a very rich man.
The Eiffel Tower symbolized an ideal Republican society, that is, the towers made up of many small pieces that interconnect and mutually support each other, all people from all walks of life mutually supporting each other in a democratic government, holding up the republic and moving it forward.
In spite of the cranky cab drivers of Paris, I love this town and I love France. And then again, cab drivers are cranky anywhere. If I could go back in time, a few things at the top of my wish list would be to hang out for a weekend at Versailles with Louis XIV, or sip a coffee with one of my own personal heroes, Victor Hugo, or watch Cézanne paint or Rodin sculpt. As it is, I'm quite content to take my coffee looking up at Notre Dame, or staring at the stained glass of Chartres Cathedral, or gazing up at the Eiffel Tower and wondering how in the heck did they get only 11 pounds per square inch at the greatest points of stress on that thing. The grace and the style and the sophistication of the French have persisted from Charlemagne right into the 21st century. How do they do it? Well, some say it's arrogance. Personally, I think it's confidence. Vive la France. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Weller.